Yeah. Welcome, everybody. I'm Susan Blunt, one of the directors of Neighbors on Call, and Becca Zirkin, our other directors here too. Neighbors on Call, or NOC, is an all-volunteer grassroots group that takes action to elect Democrats to the North Carolina General Assembly. In this election, we helped protect the governor's veto.
Wow.
And those who volunteer with us know NOC supports specifically the state legislative races that can be won or lost by slim margins. So we go into each election cycle with our eyes wide open. There's always a good chance we're going to win some and we're going to lose some, but that doesn't make the losing any easier. Ricky Hurtado's loss is hard. We've worked alongside him for more than 3 years now, and we believe we speak for everyone who volunteered for him that we truly love and admire him.
I do.
We know how hard we worked there in Alamance, along with the Alamance County Dems, county to county program, and Down Home NC, and many other volunteers. In fact, Neighbors on Call canvassed more in his district in 21-22 than in any other. And our efforts, and we hope you are too. So we know what a good campaign that he and Elaine and Cindy ran. So we're feeling good about our efforts, and we hope you are too, because we're going to need to be peppy in 2023. House District 63 has not seen the last of us. And I think there's somebody with some noise there in the background.
Susan, do you want to take a second to just mute everyone, and then that would help with the
I think that's exactly
noise.
Right.
And I will unmute myself after you do that.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. So we also have big wins to celebrate, and these are not ours alone. Of course, every volunteer and donor is a very important part of the puzzle, and we at Neighbors on Call are very proud of all of our efforts. With our help, Mary Wills Bodie flipped a Senate seat, and Sydney Batch held onto her Senate seat, and Terrence Everett won re-election to the State House, holding off a Republican supermajority. We are still watching two races, the Diamond, Staten Williams race in Cabarrus County, which is another very bright spot in North Carolina in this election. The votes are still being counted, but it does look like she has a small margin, and her House race was really an uphill battle. So we're really grateful to her campaign and all the volunteers who worked with her to get that win, because it's really huge. We're also watching Brian Farkas's House race. It is also tight. The ballots are being cured there still, and our fingers are crossed that the margin gets tight enough for a recount there. But he is behind in that race. And we want to just thank everyone who's been involved in ballot chasing and curing ballots. We know that a number of you have been doing that, so we really do appreciate that. So oops, Susan, sorry for. You want to take over that part? I apologize.
All right. Here's where the balance stands. Well, it's okay. We share a lot
yeah, we do.
in many ways. Here's where the balance stands. Even with those two key Senate wins we helped with, Republicans were able to take a supermajority in the Senate. Gerrymandering really does work, unfortunately. In the House, we talked about this earlier tonight, the Dems hold 49 seats out of 120. Preventing the Republican supermajority by just one seat. Supermajority is 60% of the seats, so they're just one short. That's assuming that Staten Williams and Farkas's results hold as they are now. Those House Dems are going to have to really hang together. Okay.
So before we hand it over to Rob, we just wanted to thank everybody on our incredible crew. You've really put your heart and soul into this effort for years. Our point people, our coordinators, our mentors, campaign liaisons, the policy team, all our other volunteer staff, and of course the leadership team. And we also have the most dedicated, hardworking volunteers anywhere. 402 of you canvassed this election cycle, and you completed over 1,500 canvas shifts. And 106 of you 106 of you phone banked with us, and you completed over 560 phone bank shifts. So you are really a force. As Terrence said on Twitter, you are truly unstoppable. With the pandemic, when the pandemic hit in 2020, we all had to shift, and you made a very quick shift to phone banking. You were relentless in phone banking. And once we got back there on the doors, look at what you did. You surpassed our 2018 canvassing by about 50%, which is amazing. And our total canvassing and phone banking shifts in this election cycle is double what we did in our first election cycle, 2017 to 2018. So we just want you to know your work is really widely appreciated. You are seen. And we just want to share what Terrence put on Twitter. And also a note that Sydney Batch actually put in the mail before Election Day. And she wrote, "There's no words to express my sheer gratitude to you all and all the volunteers who have poured their energy into my race and have lifted me up over the past 5 years. I adore you all, Sydney." So we just wanted to make sure that you're hearing some of these kudos that are coming in, because they're really for all of you. Lifting up our legislators is important, and they do sacrifice a lot for us, and they need to know how much we appreciate it. So we hope that you will join us for our Party with a Purpose coming up on Thursday, December 8th, when we are going to take time to write thank you notes to legislators. And also it's a nice chance for us to all hang out and enjoy each other's company. We'll have in-person and virtual options. So stay tuned for that for more details. Tonight, we're very grateful that Rob Schofield is here to tell us what happened and what it means and how we can keep fighting. Rob is the director of NC Policy Watch, a news outlet that's a project of the NC Justice Center. He has 3 decades of experience as a lawyer, a lobbyist, a writer, and a commentator. You've probably heard him on WUNC. Rob, we want to thank you and your team at NC Policy Watch for your relentless work and advocacy. And we are thrilled to welcome you back to Neighbors on Call for what is maybe the 6th time. I think I've lost count. We are going to hand it over to you. And then at the end, we'll have some time to take questions from the audience. Hi, Rob.
Hi, guys. I know it looks weird, but I thank you so much for the introduction. I had the nightmare that every person who goes on television or gives public speaking had tonight, which is, as I was eating tacos about an hour ago, I had a bit of a dental emergency. And so that if you saw what I really look like, you would say, oh my gosh, he's an outcast from the Beverly Hillbillies or something like that. So I'm going to spare you all from seeing that. I really do apologize for disappearing on y'all, but I am here. And I really thank you all for letting me do that. It's great to be with you.
It's nice of you to come in spite of that, Rob. Thank you.
Well, my wife probably doesn't want to look at me either anyway. So my dentist, the weird thing about all this is that I'm actually supposed to leave Friday morning for what sort of a reunion with a bunch of old college chums I haven't seen in like 25 years. So I'm really hoping the dentist gets me in tomorrow morning. It'll be an interesting day. But anyway, it's great to be with you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be back. I want to, of course, take a second just to shamelessly plug our Policy Watch team. For those of you who aren't familiar with NC Policy Watch, we are a proudly nonpartisan newsroom with progressive commentary based in Raleigh. We've got a great team of journalists: Lisa Sword, one of the best environmental reporters in the country; Greg Childress, our veteran education reporter; Clayton Hinkle, who is a longtime newsroom director who runs our website and gets our emails and produces my radio show; Joe Killian, you all know his byline. Joe, formerly the Greensboro News and Record, been one of our investigative reporters for now, gosh, 5 or 6 years. Lynn Bonner, long of Raleigh's News and Observer, covering state government. She's got a post up this evening you may not have seen about some new developments at in the judiciary in North Carolina. And Kellen Lyons is this really dynamic young reporter who just joined us earlier this year. Kellen is focusing on criminal justice and the courts. He came to us from Connecticut. We're just thrilled to have Kellen on the team as well. And the other exciting thing that many of you are aware of as well is that the network to which we gave rise across the country, States Newsroom, which is based right there in Chapel Hill, continues to grow like a weed. It's now in 29 states. This is the news organization that's directed and led by Chris Fitzsimon, who was the founder of NC Policy Watch, my longtime partner in crime. Chris now is the publisher, the top banana at States Newsroom, headed toward 40 states. Recently opened outlets in South Dakota and Kentucky. They're all over the country. You can check them out at statesnewsroom.com. And we continue to strengthen our ties with them as well, since we sort of take a little pride in having been the first one and still the flagship publication for States Newsroom. We've also got a great Washington, D.C. bureau, which we've published several of their national stories just this week. And indeed, there was, of course, the breaking news from the U.S. Senate today, which is the passage of the marriage equality legislation with 62 votes. There's a great story on NC Policy Watch about that. Very exciting to see, not a perfect piece of legislation, but a real step in the right direction by most accounts. And, frankly, it's good to see Senators Tillis and Burr on board among the 12 Republicans who are supporting that legislation. So that's great news. You probably also saw the breaking news that the Republicans in Washington have claimed control of the U.S. House. That's not much of a surprise, but it's something that finally was finalized here in recent hours. We'll be watching that very carefully, of course. And there was another breaking bit of news this evening from Lynn Bonner. As I mentioned, there was a development in the case that's been ongoing over the constitutional amendments that were placed on the ballot by the unconstitutional General Assembly a few years back. And there has, of course, been litigation ongoing about that for some time. The NAACP asking the courts to strike down the amendments as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has sort of been indicated support for that position, sent the case back through the Court of Appeals and with orders to go to the trial court to start moving forward with the case. And the Court of Appeals, it turns out, has just sort of been sitting on it, playing a four corners offense, it looks like. So the NAACP is trying to dislodge that case and has been filing a motion to get that done. So stay tuned there as well. So that's the breaking news tonight. But I really can't believe it's been 6 years since I got together with you for the first time to discuss, I guess it was the trauma of the Trump election and y'all's really determined and courageous response. There's been so much water under the bridge over these last few years. 4 years ago, we talked about the big 2018 midterm wins. 2 years ago, last Friday, I was with you for a similar debriefing where we sort of discussed the defeat of Trump and the renewed hope it offered for the country. And since then, a lot of remarkable developments and hopeful progress, thanks in no small measure to the change in the White House and at the local level, and no small measure to the work of groups like Neighbors on Call. Obviously, it's hard to overstate the impact that the decline of the pandemic and the at least knocking it down to size has had on our society. The numbers of people who were dying each week at the onset of the Biden administration compared to where we are now is just, it's unbelievably striking. It's been, we all sort of, I guess in a way, are just blocking the horror of the pandemic from our memories, but it's worth remembering how far we've come in such a short time. There are incredibly positive developments in recent years under the Biden administration. Of course, the re-engagement over the climate emergency. We were, of course, in a position as a nation in which we were effectively, had checked out of even paying attention to this existential threat to our life as we know it. The re-engagement with responsible foreign policy, again, standing for human rights in the world and standing up to the aggression of dictators, such as in Ukraine. And notwithstanding all the dire complaints we hear in many places, and some of them are justified, there's been a hell of a lot of good economic news, if you think about it, since where we were less than 2 years ago, and the decline in poverty, unemployment falling, to record lows, very low levels, consumer spending, business investment up, the federal deficit cut in half in the last year, positive news now on inflation. That seems that it's finally starting perhaps to be tamed. So obviously huge challenges remain, but there's an awful lot of reasons to be optimistic about our nation that weren't there just whatever it is 22 months ago. So let's look a little more in detail at the 2022 elections. I know you all you're all political wonks. You've been talking about this. So in many respects, I'm just preach into the chorus, but or to the choir, but here's a few things to think about if you haven't thought about them in any detail yet. Obviously, the results were very mixed, but there are some important, very positive takeaways. Clearly, the overarching national story is the surprising performance of Democrats and the big setback for Trump and Trumpism. I mean, we need to remind ourselves, of course, that for a century, midterm elections have been almost invariably favored the party not in power in the White House. And so that was the fact that ended up only happening to a very limited extent was a huge victory. I thought there was a great quote, Tom Friedman's column. Many of you maybe saw it in the Times. I guess it was yesterday. And he said, "It's why for the first time in a long time, I now feel some hope for the American political system again. Since Trump came down that escalator in 2015, the GOP establishment has tried to have it both ways. Harvest the votes from Trump's base and avert their eyes from his shameful behaviors, even his denigration of our electoral system. Trump could never go too low for them because they were addicted to the votes of his base. Well, a majority of Americans just established a floor. Or as Nick Corasaniti of the Times reported, every election denier who sought to become the top election official in a critical background state lost at the polls this year as voters roundly rejected extreme partisans and promised to restrict voting and overhaul the electoral process." It was a remarkable performance, and it was indeed the strongest performance by the party of the president during a midterm election in more than 40 years. The defeat of election deniers. I just saw a story about Madison Cawthorn. He's not even busy, as you probably have heard, busying himself to stick around in Washington. He's vacated his office and taken off for his own new Florida home, apparently built with the funds given by donors. So that's there's some pleasure there. Obviously, the retention of the Senate and the power to confirm federal judges, an incredibly important development, especially given the aggressive stance that the political right has taken vis-a-vis the judiciary and the success they had during the Trump years in remaking the federal courts. Obviously, Democrats badly need still to win the Warnock Walker race in Georgia. It would provide a little extra buffer. The 2024 elections far from a sure thing. But of course, there were some disappointments for progressives. Obviously, the razor-thin loss of the U.S. House, and here in North Carolina, mixed results. You've heard from some of the most positive ones already, with some victorious candidates tonight. But obviously, the victory for Ted Budd, though not terribly surprising or unexpected, was disappointing for a lot of people. He won with a very narrow margin, though, less than 51% of the vote. So that's probably worth taking note of. And of course, as you all have already talked about, the General Assembly and the fact that, the veto proof house hanging by a thread, that it's not a veto proof house at this point. Better than might have been expected. I think it's safe to say there was a great deal of expectation that the Republicans would have a much more successful election and increase their margins by even larger amounts. Obviously, if perhaps the biggest disappointment was the outcome, or certainly competing for one of the biggest disappointments was the loss of the state Supreme Court, and in general, sort of a washout in the judiciary. And I think there's a lot we can say about that. Maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. Of course, another positive development here in North Carolina was the congressional outcome. The fact that we have the 7-7 split. Who'd have thunk that? Who'd have thunk that North Carolina would have 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats representing it in Congress? What a concept! A deeply purple 50-50 state, that its delegation to Congress reflects that. So that's an enormously positive development. It is also a testament to power of fair maps, which was something that was more closely approximated in the congressional races. So what the heck happened? There are several takeaways. I think there are some reasons, very important reasons, for folks not to be too down or too depressed by these results, even though I know you've already talked about some of them, especially disappointing state legislative races. First, you have to reiterate once again how important continued setbacks for Trumpism really are. Everyone across the country who fought against Trumpism, whether their candidates won or lost, played a role, and that includes people here in North Carolina, even though maybe we didn't see some of the progressive successes people might have hoped for. Every dollar that has to be spent to win a race like Ted Budd's race, or to win the North Carolina Supreme Court, is a dollar perhaps that wasn't spent in another part of the country. It's important to remind oneself of that. And the fact that the big lie and the threat it posed to our democracy was really soundly defeated is just, it's hard to, as Friedman says, it's just hard to understate what a tremendous development that is. Even, my God, even Rupert Murdoch seems to be cutting Trump loose at this point. So, that's something to really feel a great sense of relief and hope about, although, we're not out of the woods yet. The second important, I think Representative Everett was mentioning this takeaway, is gerrymandering. Unfortunately, there's sort of this false narrative around that somehow we operated in this election cycle under fair maps in the legislature. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The congressional maps, I think, did a pretty good job of representing a 50-50 state, but there's no way that you get 60-40 legislatures in a 50-50 state like North Carolina if the maps are anywhere close to fair. I mean, maybe we're a 51-49 state right now, but there's no way that this state is as deeply red as its legislature would seem to reflect. And gerrymandering played an enormous role in that, although there are other factors that we can talk about. Another grounds for optimism, of course, is the rise of pro-choice voters. It clearly made a huge difference. We had heard for so long that, that wave from the Dobbs decision and the overruling of Roe versus Wade had crested, and that was all ancient history. But no, that wasn't the case. In fact, all across the nation, supporters of reproductive freedom came out in very strong numbers, both to blunt the Republican wave, and in several states where referenda were on the ballot, to stand up directly for abortion rights. There are voters in California, Kentucky, Michigan, Montana, and Vermont all voted to support abortion access or boost reproductive rights. And of course, we all know that Kansas voters did the same thing earlier this year, when nearly 60% voted to keep abortion protected under that state's constitution. So, you could have varying views on whether it's a good thing that we don't have ballot initiatives, citizen-initiated ballot initiatives in North Carolina, ballot referenda. I can envision some that might not go in a way that I would feel very comfortable with. But I think there are a lot of issues, if we did have it here, that would go in a very positive direction. And I feel totally confident that that's the case with abortion rights. And it's a sad commentary that we don't have a legislature that seems to want to respect that sort of overwhelming public opinion. Another issue in which it might be nice to have a referenda would be Medicaid expansion. You saw that even in I guess it was South Dakota, a state in which their General Assembly, it's such a deeply red state that the General Assembly, Republicans outnumber Democrats in South Dakota 9-1 in their General Assembly. And yet voters voted 56% to 44% to expand Medicaid. Makes it the 39th state. It makes us part of a continually dwindling number of states and holdouts against what would be life-saving healthcare for hundreds of thousands of people. So that's another issue that we know we're on the right side. It's going to happen eventually. So what do we do now? Obviously, it's a continued very difficult situation in the General Assembly. It'll be more important than ever for every single member to show up at all times, to be on guard against attempts to ram through things in the dark of the night. It's likely that we'll have more gridlock, more litigation. The loss of the courts is obviously a big problem and a big challenge here. I think there's a genuine and realistic and understandable concern that there's more redistricting ahead, that the General Assembly will attempt to redraw maps yet again, presumably the congressional maps, and that could present a real likelihood that the sort of 50-50 split we see right now could actually be taken away. I think it's this fact that the courts are such a problem, and I alluded to this earlier, is something to remember, that Republicans have made control of the judiciary at both the federal and state level a huge top priority for years. And they really just threw out all the old rules about judicial neutrality and the sort of traditions of nonpartisanship in the judiciary and the fact that we would play by sort of established rules. They've clearly thrown those out. They are playing hardball at all times when it comes to the judiciary. We should have seen that when they blocked Merrick Garland, whatever that was 4 years ago, and when they rammed Amy Coney Barrett through in a matter of weeks. If there was ever any doubt, it was made clear that control of the judiciary was their, a huge priority, and it's been very effective for them. And Democrats, I mean, to their credit, I think have tried to avoid playing this game. They have been responsible, thought about the judiciary as truly nonpartisan, and but I think the hard ball fact that we've learned in these recent elections was that the Republicans ran as a team. They welcomed the influx of dark money that spread outrageous rumors and outrageous ads targeting Democratic candidates. And for better or worse, that may just be how elections for judges will have to be run going forward, and Democrats may have to abandon their Mr. Nice Guy approach to those things. There's also some other lessons from the election. I think although Sherry Beasley turned out not to be a candidate who would really galvanize and excite people, she was a wonderfully strong and honorable candidate. She also followed this path of running an everywhere campaign, which I think was a helpful lesson for Democrats, that they need not just focus their efforts in progressive areas. I think it's important that we keep preaching the anti-gerrymandering gospel. We've made headway on that. We need to keep calling for independent redistricting. It's an important, widely popular point of view. One suspects the Republicans will have no interest in pursuing it anytime soon, but we've got to keep pounding on that, as progressives need to do on a whole raft of issues in which their positions are the majority position, be it the climate emergency, reproductive freedom, gun violence, healthcare, standing up to Russia and for human rights, the minimum wage, immigration reform, tax fairness, LGBTQ equality, legalizing marijuana, listening to science. Even many parts of the criminal justice system and the reforms needed there. All of those are issues that are winning issues. It's a sad commentary on our politics that issues aren't, often the deciding factor in elections. Progressives are trying to bring together a sort of a diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition that's built on issues. And it's a lot tougher to do that than to keep together a non-diverse group that's mostly built on shared racial and religious and cultural prejudices, which is essentially what the Republican Party has done. So I guess ultimately no one said this is going to be easy. It's going to take a few more years to save the country, but y'all have made enormous headway here in our area, and congratulations for that. So keep at it. There's still ongoing shifts in demographics that cause reason for optimism. There's really good reason to think North Carolina is still headed in the right direction overall. And ultimately, despite the many challenges and many defeats that have occurred, there's not that many people that need to be convinced. The margins are still very narrow. It remains a deeply purple state in which just a shift of a few points in select races can make an enormous difference. So thanks for listening. Hang in there. I'd be happy to, if we've got any more time left, to take a few questions. Maybe I'll show my face again and smile without opening my mouth. And hope that was a helpful conversation starter.
That was a great conversation starter, and I think there's a lot of questions for you, and there will probably be more in the chat. And Tracy, can you unmute yourself, Tracy, or do we have to do something?
Yep.
Okay.
No, I'm unmuted.
Tracy Rains, who's one of our chapter leaders, is going to pick out the questions from the chat. She's been following along.
Yeah, so Isabel Geffner would love to hear your thoughts on who will be running on all sides for governor.
I should also say here, as I notice, I take away my video here, that picture of me is an old one, but I guess it's a lot younger one that was taken. Anyway, yes, thank you for the question. I mean, I think it's safe. It's hard to imagine that it's not going to be Mark Robinson. I know there is talk of trying to, amongst Republicans, indeed, and maybe this will gain some momentum in the hopefully post-Trump world. He said hopefully. That there's been talk of trying to convince Robinson to run for Congress, maybe drawing him a congressional seat where he might conceivably do less damage to the party and to the country. But at this point, he seems like the far and away front runner for the Republicans. I know Dale Folwell, who frankly, in many of his views, isn't a whole lot less extreme than Robinson, has also, I think, clearly aspires to run. And I think it's safe to say that Josh Stein remains far and away the front runner for the Democrats. I've not heard of any real reports of other people who might challenge Stein, but I suppose anything's possible. Maybe some of you all have heard rumors that I haven't heard.
So, Marilyn Hartman would like to get your thoughts about what the role of voter suppression had in the North Carolina election specifically.
You know, I think one of the good news stories out of the election that maybe I should have included is I think in many ways it kind of felt like a normal election. There were some incidents in some places where we know that people clashed outside of polling places. No violence really that we're aware of. I mean, the idea of voter suppression remains, I think it's no doubt that it remains a priority for the political right. They realize that they are swimming against the national tide when it comes to demographics, when it comes to participation by non-traditional voters. And so they look for every technique available to make it difficult to vote, to discourage voting if they can. I think that it's, you know, often I've heard it, we hear these discussions about how could we have these absurd TV ads with these just hateful, dark, back and forth allegations going against each side. And I think what the data show are that those kinds of ads are a form of voter suppression. They turn people off and people just say, I ain't going to vote. And the people who are less likely to vote are the people who are probably not traditional voters. You know, we continue to see that turnout amongst older white voters remains very high. Young voters tend to vote progressive by significant margins. And while there was some pockets in the country where we saw high turnout by Gen Z voters, maybe not so much in North Carolina. So it's clear that there are forms of voter suppression that continue to work. You know, for now, obviously, voter ID remains on hold. For the most part, the efforts that might have been made to suppress voting by mail or limit early voting seem not to have had a lot of success. So turnout wasn't as high as 2018, which I think is not terribly surprising. Democrats were awfully motivated in 2018, but I think maybe that's one small inkling of good news from the election was that voter suppression tactics, you know, along with the sort of just failure of the generalized assault on democracy, seem to have kind of melted away a little bit. We'll hope that remains the case.
Do you have any data on the number of youth voters or younger voters in North Carolina?
Yeah, I've seen those reports, and I must confess I don't have them at my fingertips. My recollection from reading the stories is that in general, North Carolina did okay, but not as good as some other states when it came to young people voting. They do, you know, again, the 18 and 29-year-old voters are among the most progressive in their voting habits, but it's my recollection is that the numbers were not extraordinary. And
Okay,
that obviously remains a perpetual challenge.
Yeah. So Ann and David would like to hear more about Ricky's race, the Hurtado race, and why they are still counting in Pitt County, but there's no talk about recounting or count in Alamance. They're confused about why this is.
Yeah, some of you all who were volunteering there may have a better feel for that. I assume it's just a function of the percentage numbers and how many votes are actually in. I mean, the hard reality, I think, is that the likelihood of a recount succeeding in North Carolina, you know, we have a really solid voting system, and it's just we have not seen, with the, of course, very notable exception of the disaster in the 9th district a few years back, an election in our state in which, there's been reason to expect things to be overturned. Or, we know that Sherry Beasley sought a recount 4 years ago in the I'm sorry, 2 years ago in the Supreme Court race. And, it stayed right around 400 votes. It barely changed out of millions cast. So the likelihood of a recount in a state legislative district having an effect, better or worse, pretty remote. I honestly don't know I don't have those numbers from those respective districts. Maybe somebody else knows them better than me. I apologize for not having those at my fingertips.
So Andrea, Tanner would like to have more analysis about what happened with judicial races. So how did the Dems go from a 6-1 majority a few years ago to a 2-5 minority, and what can we do in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a, I think the first thing, as I said, is to recognize how Republicans have prioritized the judiciary. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we actually were having nonpartisan races for Supreme Court, for appellate courts, and it was the Republican move in the General Assembly when they regained control to put that back, to make them all partisan, make everything partisan, and then to spend vast sums of money, to invite vast sums of dark money into the state, to run as a team, to really, although the candidates themselves tend to continue to sort of mouth platitudes about, each case is different, and, I'm just going to apply the law and respect for precedent and all those good things. I don't think Republican voters had any doubt what they thought they were voting for. Whereas I think Democrats have not, again, maybe to their credit, embraced that, but it's been sort of almost a self, they've limited themselves, they've disarmed themselves to a certain extent. And so the hard reality is that our judicial races have become blatantly partisan ideological contests, just like about everything else right now in modern American politics. And, we all wish it weren't so, but that's what we're dealing with here. And I think the fact that Democrats have been slower to embrace that and has had a big impact on why they have fallen off in their performance. Again, the margins aren't very large, but it only, in such a narrowly divided state, it just takes a couple of points. And the way the Supreme Court works now with, you have an 8-year term, it guarantees in effect that Republicans will have control. One presumes a strong conservative ideological control of the court for some time. It's also worth noting, of course, that we used to have a much less ideological judiciary. We used to have Republicans on the court who were like Bob Orr and even at times Mark Martin, although he's taken a hard right personally, it seems, who were viewed as, reasonable middle of the road people who were not ideologues by any stretch of the imagination. So it's been a process, but it's happened very rapidly, and it seems as if it's sort of caught Democrats off guard, and it's going to, in all likelihood, we'll see. Kellen Lyons, who is our new criminal justice and courts reporter, has a story for tomorrow morning. You should check it out on NC Policy Watch, in which he analyzes what the potential impact of the transformed court could be, particularly on criminal justice issues, and why some people have some hopes and other people have some deep concerns about what this really portends for the years to come. But it's if there was ever any doubt that it's an incredibly important political realm in which Democrats and progressives generally should be more active and pay closer attention, any illusions there were completely done away with in last week's election.
So are there any groups like NOC on the GOP side, or are we, the foot soldiers, competing mainly with other non-canvassing forms of messages from the right?
I mean, my impression is that the political right has a long tradition of relying on conservative churches and conservative religious congregations as sort of their foot soldiers, if you will, to a large extent. But I'm not aware of a group specifically like Neighbors on Call in other on the political right. But they seem that they have, there are Tea Party groups, there are local, obviously lots of local Republican Party organizations. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really good question. I'm sure there are some similarities, although I'm sure their meetings aren't, nearly as fun or as engaging as these are. But I honestly don't know the names of them all. I know for a fact that there were a lot of Tea Party groups, particularly early in the decade, that were very active around the state, and I presume doing a lot of canvassing and organizing.
Do we have any idea about the 35% unaffiliated North Carolinians and the turnout there and which way they swung this year in their voting?
That is not a number that I have at the top of my fingertips. I think it's there's probably some pretty simple math that could be done to discern, how that broke down. Obviously, there are, we still have more Democrats than we have Republicans. So one presumes that there, amongst the unaffiliated voters, there was probably a slight leaning to the Republicans that enabled them to do well. But I'm sure that also breaks down along urban and rural lines, just like we see so many of the votes break down. Democrats seem to be doing even better than ever in urban areas, and Republicans seem to be doing better than ever in rural areas. So one presumes that maybe the unaffiliated track that as well. That bespeaks the fact that that's an issue I think Democrats are going to have to, it's not necessarily for Neighbors on Call to solve, but it's an issue that Democrats are going to have to wrestle with. We had a good story from Lynn Bonner this week about the demise of some African-American Democrats in the traditional Black Belt of Eastern North Carolina, who lost elections and argued, I think, persuasively in some instances, that part of the reason for that gerrymandering played a big role, but so too did the fact that they probably could have used more help from national and state Democratic leaders, more influxes of money. And I think it's clear that Democrats would be making a mistake if they simply surrender rural areas. That's something they've got to continue to engage with. And, that it's true that we sort of self-select in this country, and we've kind of divvied ourselves up in many respects politically, geographically, but obviously that's not something that you can just surrender on.
There's a lot of questions around messaging and how we get around the sort of attack messaging that the Republicans put out there. And then on the other hand, a couple people noted that the Beasley campaign took sort of a harder messaging against Bud. And do we think that had any effect on her outcome?
It's always a huge question. How do you avoid just allowing things to just as we to just sort of descending into the mud? As we said, to a certain extent, I think that's part of the strategy from the other side, is to the extent they can take things into the mud, the more it just depresses voter turnout, and probably that works to the benefit of Republicans. And I'm not sure what the antidote to that is. Sometimes you got to fight fire with fire. Beasley, say again what you were asking about Beasley. I'm sorry.
A couple people felt like her ads were more attacking of Bud, and if it was more sort of neutral.
I don't know that there's a whole lot more. I don't think that hurt her. I mean, I do think that we had Tom Jensen on our radio show from Public Policy Polling, months ago, who talked about, to me, candidly off air, about the uphill battle that Beasley faced, that it was going to be incredibly difficult for her to succeed, even if she got a lot of breaks. So I'm not sure there's a whole lot more she could have done. I think it is true that, especially when it comes to mobilizing young voters, maybe more than negative ads, what is always gold to find in the political world is a compelling, energizing, candidate who can just, fire people up. And Justice Beasley did a fine job of running an enormously competent, honorable, hardworking campaign, but that's not her. She's not a firebrand. She's not someone who's going to, rile up the troops generally. And while you can run ads that try to gin that up and the energy up for people, that can help some. I'm just not sure there's a whole lot more she could have done. She did, I think, about as well as she could. I think she had a lot of money, spent a lot of money, raised a lot of money, had a lot of very dedicated supporters. But in a year that's just designed to favor the party out of power, it would have been, unless she was just someone who was so energizing and exciting and unique and different of a candidate, I think it would have been almost impossible.
Another question about the judicial votes, and do we think that we've done enough, or what could we do to ensure that voters know the link between the judiciary and gerrymandering, abortion, all the things that are the big issues?
Yeah, it's tough. It has to be done. I think there has to be a much more explicit messaging around that. The challenge, of course, that Democrats always face, progressives always face, is that it's harder to mobilize people with thoughtful, engaging content about substantive issues. You can talk about abortion rights and you can talk about gerrymandering, and you got to do it, but it doesn't sometimes mobilize people like fear and the kind of really deceptive messages that are put forth on the other side about crime and about sex offenders and terrible immigrants who are trying to take away everything you have, and those of course are designed to appeal to a voting population with probably less of a solid understanding of how government and politics work. So it's a bit of a vicious circle. But I don't think it's at all the case that the judiciary is a lost cause, and progressives are going to have to keep pounding on that. I think probably it's going to require them to be more explicit. It's going to require more big money from out of state probably to support those kinds of campaigns. I suppose as rights continue to be eroded, if we continue to see an erosion of abortion rights, if we continue to see an erosion of, basic personal privacy, perhaps a larger group of people will finally start to pay attention. I certainly hope that's the case. It's a tough nut to crack, but I don't think it's, undoable, but it's going to take a lot of determined effort, a lot of money, a lot of creativity to win that battle.
There's a couple questions on gerrymandering itself, of course, and the age-old question of how do we combat gerrymandering?
Yeah, it's the chicken and the egg, right? It's like, how do you do it? Again, it's a long-term battle. That's all you can remind yourself of, just like all the other fights we're involved with. The fact remains that when I came to North Carolina and started as a progressive advocate before I made the transformation to a journalist 30 years ago, nobody talked about gerrymandering, or they might have, but that word had not captured the attention of the public, of the media. People were not as familiar with what it meant and how it was impacting our politics. To a large extent, we've won that battle. People understand that gerrymandering is bad, that it is harming our politics. And it's just going to take a few more years, I think, for that recognition, that realization to translate into policy changes. It's going to continue to happen gradually in some states, and hopefully it's just eventually going to reach states like North Carolina. One of the striking things, of course, from some analysis I've seen of the congressional races is that gerrymandering likely cost Democrats the U.S. House as well. That's because while gerrymandering remained largely untouched in a lot of states, although it got a little better in North Carolina, there were a lot of states in which it remained the order of the day. And indeed, there were states in which courts have stepped in to limit Democratic gerrymandering, like New York, like California, there are some improvements that have been made in producing fairer maps in some of those other states. And so if you combine that with some of the unrepentant gerrymandering that continues in other states, Texas and other parts of the country, you can make a very plausible case that the Republicans wouldn't have retaken the House without it. So, and then of course, it has to be said that the US Senate remains, just by the way it's organized, the ultimate gerrymander, because of course, of the rule that 2 senators for every state, regardless of whether it's Wyoming or California. And we know that Democrats, the 50 Democrats in the Senate represent millions more Americans than the 50 Republicans in the Senate. That one's a little tougher to fix.
Yeah. Any thoughts on the Moore versus Harper case?
Yeah, well, I think there remains optimism. The oral arguments are set for December 7th. Arlen Bonner, we're hoping, is going to get credentials to be there to cover it, which is pretty exciting for her and for us. I think there remains amongst the plaintiffs' attorneys some real and plausible hope that a majority of the court will rule that state courts must retain authority to oversee gerrymandering in their own states with respect to federal elections. If in fact the Republican position that Speaker Moore and the others are espousing were somehow to be adopted, it really would open the door to unfettered congressional gerrymandering across the country in a way that would truly be remarkable and very damaging, I fear. That said, of course, now that we've had a change in the North Carolina Supreme Court, I think there is an expectation that that court going forward will probably take a less critical view of the partisan gerrymandering that the Republicans will almost assuredly engage in. So there's a whole debate about how far the new Supreme Court would go in reversing recent precedent of the court, and I remain hopeful that the justices, even the new Republican justices, would not go that far. But one can easily imagine them just taking a different view of new maps that might be sent their way. So, might be a bit of a double-edged sword there with Moore, and maybe not quite as hopeful an outcome as might have been hoped for had the North Carolina Supreme Court remained in its present makeup.
All right, there's one last, though I don't think
Okay.
it's a very uplifting one. What are some examples of where we should have our eye on the Republican North Carolina General Assembly? Any ideas of what they're going to try to put through first?
I think I've told this story before that in 2000, after the 2011 session, Chris Fitzsimon and I sat down in the office and we looked at all the stuff that the Republicans had done. It had sort of been like a pent-up years of right-wing policy agenda seemed to have just flooded into the state as a result of them taking over the General Assembly in 2010. And I remember we both sort of said, wow, gosh, at least they got that out of their system. They must have pretty much run out of ideas. And needless to say, that was pretty naive. They never seemed to run out of ideas for repealing progress from recent decades. So I expect we'll see further attempts to make our tax system more regressive, to continue to disinvest in public education and to privatize public education, to if possible, roll back reproductive freedom. That's going to be one of the real acid tests of whether this new 7149 House of Representatives is going to hold the line and make it clear that they're not going to override a gubernatorial veto of, say, new restrictions on abortion, especially that North Carolina has now become a sanctuary state for so many pregnant people across the country. But I'm sure we'll see battles there. We'll see new efforts to restrict what sheriffs can do when it comes to immigration, try to get them to require them to participate more in immigration enforcement. You can pretty much go down the list of issues that they weren't able to get through in recent years, and presume they'll try it again. But hope springs eternal. And, I think there's still reason to be optimistic that a lot of this can be stopped. And, as has already been said tonight, folks will already be working hard to position themselves for the 2024 elections and hope they can roll back some of these gains that the right has enjoyed in recent years.
Tracy, thank you so much for handling the questions. And Rob, I have one last one for you.
Yeah.
If any of those things do come to pass and the Republicans do those things, where can we read about it?
Oh, brother. Yeah, you know where you can read that stuff. It's at ncpolicywatch.com. We're really excited about the fact that we have such a great team of journalists now. We continue to, and we're really excited about how we're working with State's Newsroom, and we look forward to even strengthening our relationship further with State's Newsroom in the weeks and months ahead. There may be some announcements around that, so stay tuned. So keep listening to our radio and to our commentaries, and again, we always are interested in receiving submissions. If you folks feel inspired to write 5 or 6 or 800 words about an issue of the day, we're always looking for progressive voices to feature in our website. We get millions of visits at this point. We've got probably around 50,000 people who get our emails each week. So we're real proud of our audience continues to grow, and we welcome your support, suggestions, ideas, contributions. Thanks for letting me plug it, Rebecca.
Thank you for all that you do. And thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I want to close with one uplifting thing that Terrence Everett just put in the chat, which is it can be stopped if we keep an eye on folks, and Neighbors on Call is not going anywhere, and we will be vigilant, and we know that we're all in this together. So we look forward to all the continued work coming up in 2023. Thank you to everybody for being here. We will see you all on Thursday, December 8th for our annual Party with a Purpose. And Rob, thank you again.